Hi, everyone. This is Ken Federnick, the host of Courageous Conversations about our schools. Before I share the conversation I had with my guest, Rich Harwood, I really want to encourage you to tune into the whole episode. Harwood, who's been working with communities across the country for over 30 years, offers some critically important, and to me, some counterintuitive advice about avoiding culture wars and getting people with different perspectives working together. If you've listened to this podcast, you know my goal has been to figure out how to have better, more civil conversations about the conflicts that divide us over parental rights, gender and sexual identity, DEI, critical race theory, the books students should have access to. But Rich suggests a very different approach. This is what he told me.
We're going to have to change the frame of the conversation if we want to move forward. We actually start with what are your aspirations for your lives and your communities? And within that, what role does education play? Not even public schools, but education. And then you get to public schools. And that fundamentally shifts the frame of reference of the discussion.
And this is what really got my attention. This is what he says happens when you ask educators, parents, and the community to start with these questions.
It pushes out the culture wars. It's the best inoculator against the culture wars because it's proactive. It's saying what we're for, not simply what we're against.
Yeah.
It's helping us see that we're in it together. Even amid our disagreements, we're in it together. And it's saying that we can do something about our lives today and how we can create something even better moving forward. That's real. That's real. One of the most important things you can do is build relationships, build trust, build norms, build confidence that we can do things. And when you build those things, some things melt away. And in other cases, other things rise to the top and you really do have to deal with them. But you're dealing with them in a different context, almost like in a different container, so to speak.
So maybe people really do need to come back and have civil, better conversations over issues they're fighting about. But we might be better off starting with, what are our aspirations? What do we really want for our children and our community? And later, you will hear Rich urge people to ask, how can we work together to build a better future for our children? And here's one more thing Rich said that really challenged my thinking about having better, more courageous conversations about our schools.
One of my complaints, I guess, or fears about some of the folks in my field, or the field I'm in, is that there's a belief that if we just hold enough conversations, the world's going to change. And I just don't subscribe to that at all.
Yikes. Was Rich referring to people like me? Probably, but his complaint is not that courageous and humble conversations are unimportant. It's that they, by themselves, are probably not enough. Okay, here's the conversation I had with Rich, where you'll hear him describe what else is needed beyond better conversations. My guest today is Rich Harwood. Rich is the founder of the Harwood Institute, an organization that helps communities create more equitable, just, inclusive paths forward. Rich is also the author of several books, like the one titled Unleashed, A Proven Way Communities Can Spread Change and Make Hope Real for All. There are now, in these divided times, a great number of organizations with similar missions. But Rich Harwood and the Harwood Institute have been doing this for over 30 years, which is longer than some of our listeners have been alive. You've been doing this a long time, Rich. So in this conversation, we don't really need to turn down the volume or to avoid political pitfalls, because that's what Rich and his colleagues are really good at. It's what they help divided communities do, which is why I wanted him to join us on this show. I wanted to learn about the dynamics that are contributing to the divides surrounding our schools, and divides that sometimes escalate into full-blown culture wars, and how we can make hope real for students and for people who care about our schools. Rich, welcome to Courageous Conversations.
Ken, thanks so much for having me.
I want you to tell our listeners about the Harwood Institute, but first let me just jump right in and have you talk about what's happening in our country and whether the polarization that's going on is going to get worse with the upcoming national election, and whether you think there's any room for hope in these really divided times.
Well, first, I think there's an enormous space for hope in these divided times. I'm engaged in this national campaign called Enough Time to Build, where I'm going across the country and speaking. And we're probably the only campaign of national campaigns. Usually campaigns only go to their strongholds, red or blue states, right? Or they go to those places where they can, quote unquote, pick off the small sliver of undivided voters that they want. And this campaign that we're doing has been invited to every part of the political spectrum in this country. I've been in Matt Gaetz's congressional district in Pensacola. I've been in Ken Buck's congressional district in Colorado, Jim Jordan's congressional district, the co-founder of the Freedom Caucus in Ohio. I've been to Fresno. I've been to Flint. I've been to Jackson. I've been to Alamance County, North Carolina. I'm going to Selma, Alabama in August. I'm going to 3 stops in Pennsylvania, one of the biggest battleground states in the country, in October. In October. So, and here's what I've learned. I already knew it, but as you know, there's one thing to know it, and then there's another thing to come to know it in your bones again, right? There's nothing that replaces the experience of it. And everywhere I go, regardless of who people vote for, they're responding to this campaign. And it's not because they like the name of our campaign or because maybe I'm a decent speaker. It's because what we're talking about. And we're saying, more divisive politics is not going to help us move forward. And instead, we need a new civic path in the country where we come together and figure out what we can agree on amid real differences, how we can get in motion and start to take action, and how we can start to build together again and restore our sense of belief in ourselves and one another, that we have the wherewithal, the public will, the courage, and the humility to get some stuff done that matters to us. And the response uniformly, I just spoke in Owensboro, Kentucky to 400 people. Based on voting returns, you have to assume 300 of them voted for former President Trump. I got a prolonged standing ovation. Now, why? Why?
That was my question. Why did they stand up?
Because the same reasons the folks in Pensacola applauded or other folks did is because people are hungry for an alternative path forward. They're exhausted. They're depleted. More than that, they're scared. They're anxious. We're suffering from an epidemic in loneliness. And people know that we can't go it alone. We need each other. We're meant to go together as human beings, and we're meant to go together in our communities. It's why we use the word community. Community means all of us, not some of us. And so I think people are really hungry for a different path forward. So you're asking me, in this time of political division, is there room for hope? Absolutely. I think there's more than room for hope. There is a hunger for hope, and not just hope, proof, concrete things that I hope we'll talk about today that demonstrate that we can move forward together, even if they're small. And I would argue they almost have to be small, because anything larger, anything too comprehensive, A, won't work, and B, won't be believed.
Rich, I just recently, just in the final stages of producing a 3-part podcast about Middletown, Ohio, and some work they did with community leaders, conservative and liberal, coming together, and with a superintendent that reached out to them and said, I need your help. We need to come together. And they avoided a culture war. And the podcast I'm so excited about, because it really details what the superintendent and board did very specifically to make that happen. And when I interviewed a woman named Trudy Palmer, she's the cover story editor for the Christian Science Monitor, whose publication had run a story written by Courtney Martin about how one community in America managed to bring a culture war, stop it in its tracks. And what Trudy said was that it gives us not just hope, but credible hope,
Hmm.
because there were very specific things, and in some cases, counterintuitive things. In this case, the superintendent, rather than fighting back against his critics and trying to defend himself and going to the newspapers, he actually stopped and invited them in to listen to them. And it changed all the dynamics because he didn't shame them, he didn't attack them, he didn't defend himself, even though he thought their accusations were completely unjustified.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Ken. We actually, in our work, tend to talk not about hope, but authentic hope.
Mm,
And and we distinguish it from false hope. So that's one, just to build on your point. The second thing is we say, what is it? One of the questions that animated me to start the Institute 35 years ago is what engenders authentic hope,
mm,
right? It's not just a feeling. And particularly in this day and age now, 35 years later, there are really practical things that engender hope, right? That things like we're taking on the issues before us, people can see it, that we're having real conversations about them, that we're discerning what we can do even amid our disagreements, that we are taking small steps forward together, that we're lifting up the things that we're doing so that they become visible to us. They're no longer invisible, that we begin to build on those things over time and create a track record. Each and all of these things engender authentic hope, to your point about credible hope,
mhm.
right? And and I think we would be wise to not simply say we want to give people hope. I think we'd be wise to make hope a verb, that we want to come together and create hope, and we need each other for that. And we can produce things or build things in order for it to happen. And I think that's actually where the action is in the country right now.
So let's shift the conversation um, to our schools because it has sort of become the epicenter of these so-called culture wars. And there's in some cases there's no more divided places right now than our schools. And I heard you on a webinar several weeks ago talking about schools ought to be the last place you would see this happening. It ought to be the place that brings people together, that bridges our divides, not that separates us. But there raging battles are happening around the books that kids ought to have access to, and parental rights, and how history should be taught. And there's no evidence at all that any of those battles are good for children ultimately. And probably a lot of evidence that because they are so distracting, um, it's pulling people that should be thinking about teaching and learning and
Mhm.
attracting and keeping teachers, for example. That's what they should be focused on. And yet they're focused on these polarizing issues. Um, so what is it that could give us authentic hope for our schools in these divided times?
Reading, Pennsylvania,
Mm,
just to be really concrete. So I won't talk about theory. I'll talk about actually, like you were talking about the community in Ohio. Let's talk about a community next door in Pennsylvania. Um, you know, when 10 years or so ago, Reading was declared the poorest community in America. It was predominantly white. Today, it's 65, 70% Latino. Um, and at the height of these culture wars that you're referring to, right? Battles over book banning, battles over DEI, battles over critical race theory, the residual battles over masks in schools and what effects that may or may not have had. Um, the recall of school board members, the rapid firing of school superintendents, all the things that we've all seen and look at with some horror, really. Like, what the heck's going on here? At the height of all of those things, we were asked to work with Reading, Pennsylvania to help create a community-led, community-driven educational equity agenda. And everyone said to me, Rich, you're crazy. It'll never happen. And it'll never happen, especially in a place like Reading, which is one of the poorest communities in America, now predominantly Latino, increasingly diverse, fragmented, doesn't have a sense of shared purpose. People don't feel like they have a voice, all the ingredients you would think that would hold us back.
can't wait to hear what happened.
Here's what happened. So we started to work with some local folks there and engage residents, both in English and in Spanish, engage leaders in deep conversations, both in deep conversations. And first, what I want to say is in those deep conversations, which took place over a number of months, not a single individual mentioned any of those culture wars topics. Not any of them. Not a single one. If I sent you all the transcripts, which we have from every conversation we did, which we have, you could do a word search and never find DEI or critical race theory or book banning, nothing.
And you were just asking them to talk about their hopes and dreams for their schools, right?
Right. So part of the answer to your question is we're going to have to change the frame of the conversation if we want to move forward. We focus a lot on people's aspirations, not their utopian dreams, nor the problems, but their aspirations for their lives and community, and then what that means for children. Not only did they not get mired in these culture war discussions, they actually produced across the community a 9-point educational equity agenda. And it deals with kids and adults and families, everything from retaining teachers to English as a second language, to early childhood education, to after school and out of school activities, mental health, on it went. Then people said to me, Rich, it's nice that you came up with this agenda and you have this nice report that kind of patted me on the head and said, nothing will ever happen, particularly in one of the poorest communities in America. Well, not only did something happen, but 4 local partners came together, and 3 of which funded this initiative to move into action. 3 teams formed. 2 years later, Ken, 2 things have happened. I'll cut to the chase here. 2 things happened. One is they have transformed the community when it comes to English as a second language. They have transformed the community when it comes to after school and out of school activities. They are working on early childhood education in a way they never have before. That's part 1. Part 2 is they have fundamentally, or I would say radically, begun to shift the civic culture of their community. In a town where people felt their voice didn't matter, now people do. In a town where people said there weren't leaders and organizations they trusted, now there are. Where people said we used to get together all the time to quote unquote collaborate, yeah, they came together, but they didn't work together. Now they're working together and having the hard, as you would say, the courageous conversations that need to happen. Where they had norms that pushed people apart from one another, that diminished their own dignity, that where people were pointing fingers at one another, now they're creating productive norms that they all talk about. Here's the thing. Recently, when I asked the folks who were working on all this, what have you created in Reading? They didn't tell me about their new strategies, programs, and initiatives, though they have them. What they said was, we're creating new pride. What they said is, people have a sense of belonging here. What they said is, we were once the butt of all jokes in Pennsylvania. Now we're starting to lead the way. What they said is, we once had a narrative that said you should leave here as soon as possible. Now our narrative is shifting to say, this is a great place to live and a good place to get an education for your kids. What they said is, we're creating authentic hope that we can tackle anything in this community.
I'm curious. It sounds like what you did with them is not come in and deal with the elephant in the room, the culture war stuff that was going on around DEI and book banning things. You came in and said, what do you want for your schools? And let's just talk about that. And the response to that was to no one, as you said, mention any of those other things. And so rather than having to try to get in the middle of those culture war things, you said, let's talk about what we want for your kids here.
Yeah, I've been working on education issues unlike you, I am not an expert on education, right? I know a lot about communities, but I've been working on education for 35 years. The reason why, I hope I'll just go on this quick tangent because it's context to the answer to your question. The reason why is because early in the Institute's work, I discovered that education is the best proxy for how people understand and relate to their community and to one another. And how they see themselves individually and collectively. And so, yes, when we start doing this work, which we've been doing for now many years, when it comes to education, but when it comes to almost any issue, we actually start with what are your aspirations for your lives and your communities? And within that, what do you want for it? What role does education play? Not even public schools, but education.
Mm.
And then you get to public schools. And that fundamentally shifts the frame of reference of the discussion. It doesn't mean we agree on everything, but it sure as hell we can come up with enough stuff that we do agree on that we can move forward, and that we realize we have to go together in order to create the things that we really aspire to in this community. And to your point, it pushes out the culture wars. It's the best inoculator against the culture wars because it's proactive. It's saying what we're for, not simply what we're against.
Yeah.
It's helping us see that we're in it together. Even amid our disagreements, we're in it together. And it's saying that we can do something about our lives today and how we can create something even better moving forward. That's real. That's real.
You've given me, it's really a wonderful insight, and this idea of authentic hope and pushing out the culture wars by coming in and doing something else that's more meaningful and authentic. I want to tell you about the kind of thing that has become the center of the culture wars here in California, in the county that I live in El Dorado County, and is happening elsewhere across the country. And it has to do with disputes over parental rights. And there are groups now that are showing up, parents and others from the outside showing up at school board meetings, demanding that schools adopt policies that would notify parents if their children are using pronouns other than their birth gender. And what people who are rights advocates say is that we deserve to know. You call us if you're going to give our child a Tylenol, you're required to do that, but you don't call us when a kid comes in and says that they're thinking about transitioning to a different gender or just exploring that. We deserve to know. You get other people showing up at those meetings, sometimes students themselves saying the reason that, ordinarily we would love to be able to communicate with parents, but in some cases it's not safe. And if students know that we're going to have to inform them of those decisions, it'll just force students who are struggling with their gender identity to go into the closet, not tell anyone. And we know how that ends up for a lot of people. They suffer, and in some cases, they even kill themselves. So that has become, hundreds of people show up in places like Temecula and Orange County and in Rockland, California, and here in my county. And so I'm wondering what you might do. And I just have to, as I'm thinking about what you just talked about, maybe what one could do is come in and say, we're going to put that aside for a moment. It's a really important thing, but we're going to talk about something that I think all of you will care about, which is what do you really want for your
Yes.
students here? And then if we need to come back to that and sort of push that out, at least tell them, at least temporarily, and then talk about these other things. What would make this school district, this community great and strong and would attract and keep teachers and would keep board members doing what they signed up to do?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're spot on. I think one of the challenges I have at times with the bridging work that's taking place across the country is that we're trying to take on the toughest issues at first and find some way forward when, if this were a family sometimes or an organization, or I've done a lot of coaching of sports. If I was coaching a team, or in my own organization right now, one of the most important things you can do is build relationships, build trust, build norms, build confidence that we can do things. And when you build those things, some things melt away. And in other cases, other things rise to the top and you really do have to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
But you're dealing with them in a different context, almost like in a different container, so to speak.
Yeah.
So to your point, yeah, I think we'd be wise to say, look, first of all, I think you have to say, we hear you. I mean, you have to
Mm.
legitimately say, we hear you. And you have to demonstrate what that means. Like you can't just try to push it under the rug, sweep it under the rug, right? Because people are concerned about something. And I think we have to legitimately say, we hear you. We have to legitimately say, we will come back to this. In the meantime, we want to do some other work here, which we think will help us. So let's do that first. And my experience is that that eases the ability to, as I said before, to deal with some of these other things. So that's where I would start.
Yeah.
Now, when I got called into Newtown after the massacre in that school to help the community move forward, that wasn't a possibility. There we had to deal with the after effects of a horrific, inexplicable massacre. And that's a different type of challenge. But here I think we can. That's sort of one part of it. The other part of it is whether it's the example you gave, Ken, or banning of books, or what we teach to third graders about certain topics. I think that we have to get underneath the labels. We have to get underneath the rhetoric, and really try to understand what is it that people are really concerned about. Because I'm a parent. I have two kids. They're older now, but I would be concerned about what they're learning in second or third grade for sure. I might be even concerned about what books are in the elementary school library. So I think we need to be careful about whether you're on the conservative, quote unquote, conservative side or quote unquote, progressive or liberal side. We jump in too fast with labels and with preconceived notions and stripping people of their humanity where they might have some real concerns. So I think we do well to create a space where we could start to hear what some of those are in a safe way, and as you would say, a courageous way, and try to see what that surfaces for us, and then see, are there some ways in which we might figure out how we can move forward? Are there some guidelines we could create, sensible guidelines?
Mm-hmm.
I think most people are pretty sensible. Not all, but most. The vast majority are sensible. That's been my experience now over 35 years. The vast 80, 90% of people are pretty reasonable. So what are the guidelines we might be able to come up with? And then I do think that those in leadership positions have to know that they can't be all things to all people. And we do have to make judgments, and we do have to make choices. And not everyone's going to like them. And that's what it takes to move communities or groups forward sometimes.
Mm. And I had an experience doing some work when I was running a national school turnaround center, working with some really struggling schools. There was a high school in Los Angeles, a very large high school, but 3,500 students. And one of the really large departments had about 50 faculty in it. And they, for some number of years, half of them didn't speak to the other half. And they wouldn't say hello to each other in the hallway. They didn't collaborate. We couldn't do what we had intended to do, which is to talk about teaching and learning and creating better spaces for kids to do better and support teachers in their efforts to do that, because the climate and the levels of trust had gone was so toxic. And when I met with this group of faculty, I asked them if they would be interested in changing that pattern. If they would that make a difference if we could find a way out? Unanimously, everyone raised their hand. When they described themselves as Crips and Bloods, he says, we're about that bad. And some of them couldn't even remember how it started.
Mm-hmm.
But what they all agreed on was we want to do something different. So without going back and running through the history of that and trying to resolve those things, we just said, if you were to move forward, what values would you want to live by, and what would you do and not do? Which is, and they had a long list of things. We narrowed it down to something everyone could remember, and then said, how many of you would be willing to commit to doing this? And virtually everybody raised their hand. I said, we got to come back about every month and talk about how it's going, and because there are going to be some slip ups and things. But it made a dramatic difference. And to your point, people didn't like being there.
Yes. No one likes, very few people like being there. Most people don't want to engage daily in conflict. Most people don't want things to be acrimonious. Most people, like in this case, faculty members, I'm sure you asked them at some point, but whenever I work with professionals, I always ask them, what were your aspirations when you entered this field? Um, those have often gotten caked over. They've often gotten pushed aside. Sometimes they've gotten denigrated or diminished by others, and they need to be rediscovered and reanimated. But they're there. They're there, and they're there for all of us. And so, you know, I recently, we recently released a report for the first phase of our work in a community, and we're starting the action phase now. And as I was going around town holding roundtables and giving talks and engaging people about what we learned from the community and how we might move forward, I was dogged by a group, an extreme group that wanted to take us on and cascaded us on social media and called us names and followed me from place to place and tried to get me to say the wrong thing so that they could quote me, all the things you would imagine. But here's the thing, much to your story, people kept coming up to me and saying, thank God we're having a different conversation.
Mm.
Thank God we're starting to think about how we can move forward together. Thank God we're not going to relitigate everything from the past. Some things we have to, like how this, about race and other things and bigotry. Sometimes we have to, but by and large, so many of the things in this community didn't need to be relitigated, don't need to be. We need to figure out how we want to move forward and get moving. And so again, going back to this question about where do I find real hope from? I find it from people stepping forward and saying, enough, let's get going. And we've got some stuff we got to do in this country. We're obviously not on the path we want to be on. We're not reflecting the better parts of ourselves in many cases. Or if we are, they certainly aren't being reflected enough in our public square. And so let's do something about that.
So let's for people listening to this to say, okay, that's great. That gives me a sense of hope. Maybe not authentic hope yet, but it sounds good. What do if I'm a school leader, a school board member, a superintendent, a principal, a parent, I hear this and I think, so what do we do next? What steps do we take? Do we need someone like you to come in and facilitate it, or can we do it on our own? I just need to know, how do we get started?
Yeah, well, in Eugene, Oregon, we're working with a group of folks. I've never been to Eugene, and they've been using our work for years now. And so, they got some stuff off our website. They, I think, went to one of our virtual public innovator labs, but they keep expanding the group. It's school board members, it's concerned citizens, it's business folks who have gotten together, and they've started to have these conversations. They've started to apply these principles that they read about in one of my books about how you get in motion. We have these 4 mantras: turn outward, get in motion, start small to go big, and create a new trajectory of hope. They're doing it on their own. I've never been there. So I'm hoping to go there for our campaign. But I've personally never been there. So, I don't think you necessarily need someone from the outside. Sometimes you do, but a lot of times you don't. And I think and you definitely don't need a consultant coming in who's going to tell you what to do. Please don't spend your money hiring a consultant who's going to create the plan for you and then leave or implement it for you.
Yeah.
This is a community coming together to do the work the community needs to do. So I would say you can start this. You can start this around a local elementary school, around a high school. You can start this if you're a school district leader or a nonprofit leader. You can start this. You can help to catalyze this in your community by pulling people together and getting moving. And it's all doable. Now, just to be real, it doesn't happen overnight. There are no quick fixes. I don't think there's any magic solutions. There's no comprehensive plan you can use. I believe it's by first understanding what really matters to people and then starting to peel off what small actions can you begin with that are actionable, doable, and achievable. And if you do this with intentionality and you're open to serendipity, to things happening you couldn't have imagined or predicted, what happens is you unleash a chain reaction of actions that take root, grow, and spread over time. And as they spread, more and more people see them. It's kind of like a lighthouse or a signal. And as people get these signals, they pull you toward them. And as they pull you toward them, they start to embrace this approach. And that's how it spreads in the community. Don't try to do too much too fast. Start small.
It just makes me think that something I've done, just sort of intuitively thinking this might be a good thing to do, and it seemed to, is some local school districts I've been asked to come in. We sat down and I had them meet in small groups and talk to each other about what they appreciated most about their school district to begin with. They were talking about things they were worried about, and they were sort of focused on what's not there. But I asked them to focus, what do you appreciate about even being part of this community? And then what are some of the things that would make this district even stronger? And they started identifying those things, and it wasn't put in negative terms. We did that for 5 hours, and they listened to each other. And at the end of it, I asked them to give me some feedback on how this went. And they said, half of them said some version of the biggest complaint we have is this didn't go on long enough.
Right.
It was on a Sunday.
Right.
Board members and school administrators, and it was a district that in our county is one that most of the board members are quite conservative. And they said, we don't talk to each other like this. School boards are not good places to do that. But when they sat and listened to each other and they thought, what's our path forward here? And they identified some things. So it makes me feel that I may have been on the right track in doing it that way.
Absolutely. Listen, a couple of points. One is, by asking the questions you did, you changed the frame of the discussion. Normally we start, as you said, with like, what are all the problems? Well, that just leads us into a toxic cul-de-sac called America Public Discourse, where we just point fingers, cast blame, try to figure out who we can pull down because they didn't do their, quote unquote, do their job. And it actually turns us into claimants too, and consumers of education, because we think someone else needs to do everything and they're to blame. Or we create these utopian visions which have no relevance to our reality, and we wonder why they don't go anywhere. But what you did is you started with, tell me what you appreciate, which is real, right? Because you're naming things that you can see or feel or you've experienced, right? Which also validates or values is a word I'd rather use. Values your lived experience and our collective lived experience. And then second, you said, what can we do to strengthen this? Which is not like, why isn't everything working? It's, okay, implied in that is, what can we do together?
Yeah.
So that's one point I want to make. The second thing is one of my complaints, I guess, or fears about some of the folks in my field, or the field I'm in, or have been associated with, is that there's a belief that if we just hold enough conversations, the world's going to change. And I just don't subscribe to that at all. I believe that these conversations, the ones you described, or the ones that I described in Reading or in other places, they're vital because they change the frame of reference of what matters to people. And they're no longer a technical discussion, they're now a public discussion. That's necessary, but it's not nearly sufficient. We have to do
what more is needed after that?
We have to build together.
Yeah.
We have to do things together. To your point about credible hope, what I would call authentic hope, people need to see proof, particularly today, that we're not just talking, which is good, but that we're doing things and we're building things and we're creating things and we're achieving things, and that it's possible to do that. And so we've got to pivot from talking to action. And that's really really critical in this work.
I could imagine that it being a real trap. You have these conversations and people come away saying, we've not had conversations like this, and it feels so great. We're finally uh, building a little bit of trust. That honeymoon phase could be kind of a trap because you leave and go, God, things are going to be better now. And what you're saying is you got to come back and say, okay, what are we? Let's pick off some things that we can actually do. Start small, and keep coming back. We've had a great conversation. We'll continue that, but now we have to start doing things together.
Right. It's a trap not only because of what you said, but there's another trap which you alluded to earlier, which is suppose we have these great conversations. People get all jazzed about them. They say, oh, this is wonderful. We haven't had conversations like this before, which I hear all the time. And then we don't do anything. Here's the other thing I hear all the time. Like in almost every community today, I hear this. I'm tired of going out to have these conversations because nothing ever happens. And what you learn is that there is a norm. In a lot of communities, there's no norm of conversation, so that's bad. But in even communities where there is a norm of conversation, there's also a norm of inaction. And inaction breeds frustration. Frustration breeds skepticism. Skepticism, ultimately, if we're not careful, breeds cynicism and mistrust. And now we've got a real challenge on our hands because now we have to not only do something, we have to undo some things. And, that's a much harder thing to do. All doable, but why spend the time creating cynicism and people retreating when we can take an alternate route? Like, why? It doesn't make any sense to me.
It just made me think that this podcast is courageous conversations about our schools, but there could be a footnote or something else that said courageous actions
Yes,
to make our schools stronger or something.
absolutely.
But it starts. I think it probably has to start with a conversation.
Yeah, because here's the thing: when it doesn't start with a conversation, and when it doesn't start with a conversation that changes the frame, as you did in the example you gave, what happens is we end up focusing just on problems. They may not even be rooted in conversation. They just may be rooted in people complaining in the community. And B, we jump immediately to solutions, and then we end up in these solution wars. And now it's just a competition between groups. So this is almost like the competition that you were talking about before with the culture war you described happening in districts across California. They're in a solution war, right? Different people have defined the problem differently. They're not talking to each other. So now they're trying to gain the upper hand on who's going to define it. And second, now they've articulated different solutions that may or may not have any relevance to what people are actually concerned about or what they want in their community. So we're doubly going down the wrong road. So I think it's both that it has to start with a conversation, has to start with a different conversation, and then hopefully that will lead to action.
But Rich, I'm gonna leave it there. It's been a really terrific conversation between the two of us, and I've learned some things myself, which I hope our listeners have too, about sort of how you it's sort of a jujitsu move you're talking about, is when you confront a problem is just to acknowledge it, honor it, and say it's real, but we're going to put it over here temporarily, and we're going to talk about something that we probably mostly agree on, is what do we want for our kids and our community. And
Yes.
let's do that and then see if we need to come back to that. And it may be we don't really need to, because now we're, going back to the story I told you about Middletown, Ohio, the really cool thing that's happening there is not only did they avert a culture war, but as I say at the closing comments, and Courtney Martin says it beautifully, the lesson there was the dilution of the distraction, because what it enabled them to do is to focus on what may be the single greatest threat to our schools right now, which is chronic absenteeism. 45% of the kids in Middletown, and it's true, across the country since the pandemic aren't showing up on a regular basis to school. And so these members of the community from the Ministerial Alliance, this group the superintendent called Positive Gossipers, working with school administrators, are going out into the community together to find out why kids aren't going to school. It has to do with, it's complicated. It's transportation, it's anxiety, it's mental health issues, it's poverty, it's homelessness. But they're not approaching it from a punitive standpoint. Like, if you don't come, this is what'll happen. Is how can we help figure out what you need to get your kids back in school, because we really want them there. And that wouldn't be happening if they were distracted by a messy culture war. But they're not distracted by that anymore, and they're working on this together.
Yeah, that's a great story. It's so much easier to get entangled in distractions because they don't ask anything of us, really. They don't require anything. We don't necessarily have to lean into them. We don't have to work through anything. We don't have to make discernments. We ultimately don't really even have to make choices. And we don't have to take action in the way that we've been talking about today. But here's the thing. I think more than anything, people are looking for a sense of meaning and purpose. They may not use those words. They're looking to focus on things that matter to them and to others, and for us to find a way to prove to ourselves that we can come together and do some things, even if they're small. And so I think in this case, you're outlining a really fundamental choice we face today. Do we want to become entangled and mired in distraction, which actually undermines the very thing that we want most? Or do we want to choose a different path? And I happen to think that most of us, 80%, maybe 90%, want to choose the alternate path. We may not know exactly how to access it, and we may not exactly know what to do if we're on it, but we sure as hell know we want to be there.
Yeah.
And so I think our job is to find ways to get there and to move on it.
I want to respond to something and run an idea by you based on what I've just heard you talking about. Is it seems to me that a community, a school district, a school could experience something of a kind of a moral vacuum or a values vacuum when people aren't talking about what they want. They're not having the right conversations. They're not looking forward. And in that vacuum, when people, we hear these stories, and I've seen it myself when teachers stay in their classrooms, they don't want to come out and collaborate. The high school I mentioned, where half of the faculty wasn't talking to the other half, that when you have that sort of vacuum, it's like a perfect opportunity for something else to replace it, something toxic and dysfunctional to come in, and then everyone can get riled up, or everyone can say, I don't want a part of it. But if you, in thinking about what a place that hasn't yet experienced a culture war can do to prevent it from coming in, is to address that vacuum if it exists.
Yes, I think the vacuum you're describing that's the exact word I use in a lot of the talks I'm giving, which is there's a vacuum in our community and public life today, and it's being filled in many cases by the loudest and most divisive voices. And much like you just described, people are kind of in a fight or flight mode, maybe a freeze, but primarily fight or flight. And yes, I think communities, the best way to inoculate the community from having that vacuum is to engage people in these conversations and the work of community, which not only inoculates you, it creates something productive. And I do think that's a path forward. And back to your very first question, I actually think it's the answer to our political problems today, because I think the change that is required in the US today is going to come not exclusively but primarily from our local communities where we can do this kind of work and where we can grow it,
Yeah.
where it can spread. And that's why I think this conversation and the other conversations you're having with folks are so important, because I think this is where the work is that we need to do.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you so much for being part of Courageous Conversations about our schools and for sharing your wisdom and experience with our listeners. And thanks, too, for the important bridging work you and your colleagues have been doing in communities across the country. I love the story about what happened in Reading, because it is what you're doing in communities, but it's around what was happening in the school systems. And I think the great lesson there is this idea of your term for it was authentic hope. And what I heard from one other person who observed what was happening in Middletown, Ohio, was credible hope. It's not just a feeling of hope and something that may portend a better future, but actually something you can point to and say, we're doing that, we did that, and things are changing and getting better. So for those listening in, you can find this and all of our episodes at schoolconversations.org, along with episode notes and links to the Harwood Institute website and other related resources. You can also find all of our episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. So long, everyone.